Welcome to Sabby Sab's podcast. I'm your host, Sabrina Salvati. My special guest today is Colonel Larry Wilkerson. He is a retired U.S. Army colonel and the former chief of staff to Secretary of State Colin Powell. Colonel Wilkerson, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So I have so many questions for you considering the time that we are in right now. I know during your time under Colin Powell, you did have criticism about the Iraq War. And I know during that time, that was not something that was a popular position for people to take. I remember even when we talk about people in a popular entertainment, I do remember Phil Donahue getting a lot of pushback for criticizing the Iraq War. I also remember the Dixie Chicks. I remember they received a lot of pushback and they were canceled by a lot of people. Later on, this became more of a popular position. So I think the first question that I have for you is, what was it like being a part of that administration during that time and having those critiques of the Iraq War?
All in all, it was the worst 4 years of my some 40 years in government. And that's not because of my boss. My boss was a wonderful man to work for and a true decent human being, as well as an extraordinarily competent strategist, politician, you name it. But he deserved a better president. He deserved a better vice president. He deserved a better Secretary of Defense. By the time we got through with those 4 years, we were hardly talking because we were also mad at all of those people. So it was a tough time. I was opposed to the 2003 Iraq War as a military professional because, and this may sound strange, but I think it is the proof positive of what has happened to us today in spades. There was a balance of power in the Persian Gulf, and the balance of power was established by H.W. Bush when Colin Powell was his chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And that balance of power was a rough balance of power, but it was between Saddam Hussein on one side, the Arab country of Iraq, and the theocracy, if you will, on the other side, the Persian country of Iran. So if you were going to, in 2002, 2003, or whenever, given that situation, take out one of those fulcrums, one of those balancing entities in the Persian Gulf, you had two choices. You would let chaos reign, and chaos reign over 20% of the world's oil supply, or you would go in and balance yourself. Well, guess what we've done? We've gone in and balanced ourselves. We now have more forces. Most Americans have no clue about this. We have more forces in the Middle East than we do in Europe. We have more forces in the Middle East than any other place in the world. And it's astonishing that we get away with the American people, the tax dollars and everything else, because we really have no significant interest there other than that oil flowing now to our allies, because we don't really need it anymore. So that was my principal objection. And people today will say to me, well, did you object to the killing and all the rest? Well, of course I did. It was useless, both sides. We lost 4,000 or 5,000 Americans and allied partners, and good Lord, we probably killed 100,000, 200,000 Iraqis. And we put 15 million Iraqis into either internal diaspora or into an external diaspora. And the region hasn't recovered yet. Iraq hasn't recovered yet. We're still seeing the repercussions of our war started in 2003. So that's a long answer, but I really think we screwed the region up badly.
I agree with you on that. I've noticed a change over the years. I remember, a lot of people don't know this, I don't think I've told this story, but George W. Bush actually met him in person, not on purpose, but
Good qualifier.
He was very, when I met him in person, I said to myself, I see why some people, voted for him because he didn't come across the way that, for example, previous presidential politicians did. He spoke just like a typical, average, everyday guy. He was very down to earth. And I was surprised, like in person, I was just like, wow, he's just talking like people I went to high school with. I went to high school in North Carolina. So I was like, he sounds like people I went to school with. He didn't sound like this, snooty, like politician or someone who came from like a political family. So I was like, I can see how people may have thought, okay, well, this guy seems like an okay person, whatever to vote for. But I've noticed there has been a big change within the Republican Party. More people are against that style of leadership that George W. Bush had because of the Iraq War. And more people started to lean towards, I guess, what you would call a right-wing populism, more like the Donald Trump-like style. But what was interesting to me is that even though there were protests during the Iraq War, I do feel like it didn't receive as much attention as it could have if we had social media during that time. Because I remember even thinking back then, I fell for it. I fell for we're going in there to take out the bad guys and Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass. I fell for all of that. And so I was very surprised to find out that that was not the case. And I'm curious to hear how you felt about that, the fact that there were people protesting the Iraq War at that time, but it was shamed upon. Like people did kind of look at you in a certain way and like, how dare you protest against this war? How did you feel about that during that time? And do you think that social media could have played a difference?
I do. I went to London in the middle of the largest anti-war protests in the world's history. I mean, it was incredible. Bobbies on their horses couldn't even move. I feared for the horses because the horses were immobilized. And horses strike out sometimes when they get immobilized like that. It was the biggest crowd I've ever seen in London, and I've been there for New Year's Eve. Did it do any good? No, it didn't do any good. We went to war anyway. And that was a shame, really, when I look back on it. Because, as I said, not only did we destroy the balance of power in the Gulf, but we put the Gulf in chaos, absolute chaos. Iraq still hasn't recovered from it. Syria now is partly a result of that. We don't know which way Syria is going, but I'll tell you right now, the Israelis, I saw satellite photography this morning. That's where I came from. The Israelis are already building internments in Syria. They're already occupying portions of Syria that are even outside the Golan Heights. So we've got a mess going there. The Turks are never going to permit that. So we may have a clash between Ankara and Jerusalem before this is over with. But to your question, I don't think we have had a really serious anti-war movement in this country since Vietnam. And as you and I were discussing before we went on the air, I think part of the reason there was the draft. You had young men and young women, mostly men at that time, but some women, who were threatened by the draft. And we don't have anything like that today. What we have today is a mercenary military. And that's no insult to those who do serve, but it's a mercenary military. You talk to almost any of the young men, young women, they'll tell you they came in for a college education. They came in for the $50,000 bonus. Now in the Navy, they came in for the $100,000 bonus. I mean, it's incredible the money we're paying to get these people to serve. And even with that, for the last 3 years, the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force have not met their recruiting goals until this last year. And you know how they did it this last year? They did it with women. Women volunteered at a staggering rate over the last year and made up for the very big shortfall in men so that the Army barely made its recruiting goal by about 2 soldiers. They made their goal. And now, just aside, Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth, his new Secretary of Defense, are making signals and signs like they don't like women. They particularly don't like them serving in combat positions. I've gotten emails recently, for example, one Navy lieutenant commander was on her way to Top Gun school. She had lots of carrier landings. She had a year in combat flying F-18s, a competent naval aviator going to Top Gun school, which tells you she was pretty good because only about the top 10% go there. Her commander called her in, her male commander called her in and told her her orders were canceled and go pack her bags, that she was not going to be in a combat position anymore. This is going out in the services right now, that women don't belong in combat, and maybe even women don't belong in the armed forces. I'm sorry, you're not going to have any armed forces left if you say that. So reality will hit them finally. But we do have that problem, and I think the fact that we have an all-volunteer military, and as one senator said to me when I was talking about how badly we treated them, well, they volunteered. And that's the way the Congress looks at it, basically. They look at both parties. They look at it that way. They volunteered. So if they die, that's their fault. If they volunteered, well, why am I to blame? Why do I have anything to do with it? Well, you let the president send them to war in Afghanistan and in Iraq and other places. Well, that's because the president did it. We signed the AUMF, but we didn't give him carte blanche, and he stayed in Africa. All kinds of excuses, but Congress no longer has any willpower over the war, the constitutional war power that they have. Most Americans just are so obtuse today about the Constitution. They don't realize that the president has no war power whatsoever. The only war power is in the Congress, but the Congress has abandoned it. And so we go to war on the word of presidents now, not the word of Congress. So we're in real trouble in the American empire right now because of many things we've done to ourselves. But most of it has been done since 9/11 and an overreaction to 9/11 by the president whom I served most closely. And let me pick up on what you said and say I saw George Bush sort of that way too. First time I met him in the Oval Office, I spent 30 minutes with him. I was newly appointed chief of staff at the State Department, and he had a policy to welcome all departmental chiefs of staff in the office. Shake hands, sit down, talk, chat for a few minutes. And he was a very personable guy. And fast forward a moment, I taught on 2 campuses for 16 years at William & Mary and 6 years at the George Washington University, National Security Affairs, essentially. And what I came to find over that time, as I studied the second Bush administration with my students and thought about the first one, as well as studied it with my students, was that the vice president Dick Cheney had captured the first 4 years, captured them basically for national security issues, including the war. And what you saw and what I saw in the president was what you described. A hail fellow, well met, a pretty decent guy, a Christian who believed in his Christianity, who was misled by his vice president, misled all over the place by his vice president. And that's what got him into the war. I think probably if he were telling you the truth today, he'd say he regrets that decision. He's the only one who in his memoirs wrote, "If I had known at the time that Saddam Hussein did not have weapons of mass destruction, I would not have gone to war." He was lied to by the intelligence complex, led by the vice president of the United States. And Powell and I got captured in that environment too when we had to go to the UN and make that presentation. And that's when we really kind of fell out after that and really didn't have too many good words for anybody. We had people in the State Department, the Deputy Secretary of State, calling Dick Cheney and his office the Gestapo and the Nazis and the Schutzstaffel SS. That's how we referred to them. So that's the reason I say that was a very tumultuous period in my life, and I wouldn't live it over again for anything.
I can only imagine. It's interesting how much power Dick Cheney had and when he was the vice president. And I was saying this as well during the Biden administration. Every time I had criticism of the Biden administration, and especially when Kamala Harris was announced as the nominee, the feedback I would get with some people is that she's just the vice president. She doesn't have any power. And I would always remind them, well, Dick Cheney had a lot of power. And then it also didn't look great when Joe Biden came forward and said, yes, she was involved in every decision that I made. She was in the room. And it's just like, oh, my God, like, you're really going to lose this election. Because that brings me to the Gaza situation. Yep. Because the biggest mistake I think that Kamala Harris made was not differentiating herself between Joe Biden, particularly on Gaza. And I've explained this to people before. When you don't oppose those crimes abroad, the crimes of the empire come back home. So when you show the American people that you're not even willing to say, you know what, this is they are attempting a genocide here. They are trying to dispel the Palestinian people. They want the land. I don't agree with that. Here's what we're going to do. When you can't acknowledge that and you're running for president, what happens is people shift all the way to the other side. And I think that's how someone like Donald Trump was able to win again, because if you can't call out genocide, well, then why would people, anything's a go now, anything's a go. So this is Trump's second presidency, and he's already done some crazy things, some things that people applaud, but some things that are obviously outlandish. But I feel like the outrage is not as intense this time around as it was during his first presidency, because the Biden administration gave the green light to a genocide. Why do you feel that these politicians, particularly, I know Biden is Zionist, but more so Kamala, why do you feel they refuse to try to hold Israel accountable, other than, the lobby interest group like AIPAC? Like, it's ridiculous. If it was Russia that was doing what Israel is doing, they would be calling it out vehemently. But they will not push back on Israel.
Well, that's a pretty good analysis you gave. Let me back up and pick up on one thing you said. Shirley Ann Marshall, a political scientist at Gettysburg College, wrote a book right after Bush left his second term called The Co-Presidency of Dick Cheney and George Bush. It's a very good book, and she's absolutely right. It was a co-presidency in the first term. Bush figured it out, put Cheney in a closet, and had a fairly successful second term with Condi Rice as his Secretary of State, who got along with him very well. We have to remember, too, that Karl Rove was whispering in George Bush's ear all during the first term that his opponent in 2004 for a second term might very well be his Secretary of State. So that kind of soured the relationship, if you will, between Powell and Bush. Not personally, but fearfully on the president's part, politically fearfully. And there's no fear like political fear. But coming to your points about Kamala and about Gaza, I agree with you 100%. I think she should have taken a dramatic foot down, stomping stance with regard to Gaza and told the president and Jake Sullivan and Anthony Blinken to go to hell, run her own campaign and look like a powerful president, a powerful woman president, the first one. She didn't do that. She just kind of, as you intimated, she just kind of went along with the flow. And actually, I watched her quite frequently. She wouldn't take questions. She wouldn't answer questions when they did come. She gave some kind of pablum because she didn't want to deviate. But let me tell you why, in essence, that's the case. Israel does not own us. We own Israel. Israel is doing what the people in this country who have taken over the reins of power. And I'm waiting on tenterhooks to see if Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, J.D. Vance, Donald Trump, and this host that he's brought in with him are of this type. Because I suspect they are, if you scratch them hard. But the people who are running this country right now are so frightened of our losing our global hegemony that they're willing to do anything to maintain it. And one way they're using Israel right now is to create chaos in the Levant, chaos in the Middle East. And they're using Ukraine for the same purpose. We have an arc of instability, chaos, and confusion now going from the Arctic Circle all the way down to the southern end of the Persian Gulf. And this chaos and confusion is not only to allow us to reestablish economic hegemony over Europe because we were losing it. Germany was taking it away from us. Who did the Nord Stream pipeline? Who blew up the Nord Stream pipeline? Give you three guesses, and the first two don't count. So we're trying to prevent this shift of power, this major shift of power from the west to the east, because that's where it's going. 1 in 5 people on this earth is Chinese. 1 in 5 is Indian. 3 in 5 are Asian. 60% of the world's 8 to 10 billion people by mid-century are Asian. That's where the power is going. That's where the money's going. That's where the culture's going. That's where the education's going. That's where the development is going. That's where everything that demarcates an empire or a powerful group of countries, in this case, is going, which is historical because that's where it came from. For the first 3,000 years of human history, the power was in the east, and then it slowly drifted to the west. And the United States became the penultimate empire, or Britain was the penultimate empire that spawned the ultimate empire, the United States. And now it's going back. It's creeping back. It's being sucked back majorly by the huge size and power of the Chinese economy. But there's a lot of others around them too. Now there's Russia in that group. Russia's got a choice to make. Unlike any other country in the world of major significance and certainly of nuclear weaponry, it's in both worlds. Russia is in Europe, and certainly west of the Urals, it's in Europe, and it's also in Asia. Vladivostok is flat in the middle of Asia. So Russia has a choice to make, and it seems like we're forcing it to make a choice to go with the movement towards the east, with China, with other countries out there like Indonesia, one of the most populous countries in the world. And other than the population in India of Muslims, the largest Muslim population in the world. So this shift is taking place, and we're fighting it tooth and nail. And we're using Israel and Ukraine right now as our foremost on the ground proxies to wage this war. And we're ultimately headed for waging war with China.
This explains a lot, because I know I was very shocked but excited about the pro-Palestinian protests that we had, not just in the US, but in the world. And I'm seeing, I was here in Boston, went to the protests here in Boston, but also in DC, over 500,000 people. And I'm just like, the whole world is pushing back against the West and their agenda. And I think what may have happened, and correct me if I'm wrong, it almost seems like to me, I told people the Biden administration 100% was in agreement with what Israel was doing, because they want Israel to have that land as well for their own U.S. interests, right? I think the Biden administration, they were shocked to see that the world was against what they were doing. I don't think they anticipated hundreds of thousands of people coming out into the street saying what Israel is doing is wrong. It almost seemed like they didn't know how to respond to it at first. And so then later on, Antony Blinken comes up with this jargon of, well, we also know the Palestinian people, need to also have a state and have some self-determination. But they weren't saying that at the start after, October 7th. And I really didn't hear them talk much about the occupation before October 7th as well. But it almost seemed like they didn't know how to respond to the reaction from the public and people chanting Genocide Joe outside of a Democrat events, etc. And they're like, oh, crap. Well, what do we do now? The people are against us. And I felt like the rhetoric that came from Antony Blinken was just so much in a way to try to get people to calm down a little bit and to make them think that there's going to be justice here for the Palestinian people as well, when in reality, what you're saying is that the U.S. government 100% is supporting what Israel is doing.
Absolutely. And, one of the indicators of what you're just talking about, and it brings in your comment about social media too, one of the reasons, if not the reason, we had a problem with Chinese ownership of TikTok, although it wasn't really Chinese ownership. There was a guy in Singapore, but we had a problem with that was because TikTok was carrying the message all the time, whereas the mainstream media in the empire was not carrying the message. It was not making Palestine an issue. It was making Israel in the October 7th attack by Hamas on Israel the issue. And that was fine with Biden and Blinken and Sullivan. That was fine with them because that's what they wanted. And it was absolutely fine with Netanyahu, of course, because the exquisite Israeli propaganda campaign was working. But TikTok was defying it. So we had to come up with a security reason. Yeah. And I'm curious, I want to know, why did Trump reverse that? He, at least for a short period of time, he's reversed that, because in every other respect, except personal, I think he detests Bibi Netanyahu. Trump actually detests Bibi. But in every other respect, he's even worse than Biden, Blinken, and Sullivan with regard to Israel and what he wants it to do. And I think this comes from his transactional nature, where he sees those beaches in Gaza, he sees that Mediterranean coastline, and he envisions hotels, casinos, and all the rest of the things. And he just like to move the Palestinians. I understand right now he's recently suggested that maybe they should just go here, here, and here. He started with Jordan, Egypt, and other Arab countries. Then he decided maybe he would send them to Southeast Asia. Now I understand he's got advisors talking to him about, could we take them? And of course we could. I mean, we could if he wanted to. Most Americans have no clue about this, but we are one of the least dense countries on earth. We're certainly the largest, least dense country in terms of population. You know, we have vast swaths of land. It's not sometimes the most hospitable land, but we have vast swaths of land that's unoccupied. And could it be occupied by other people? We could take on another 50, 60 million people easily without straining a lot of our resources and a lot of our land and food and everything else. That is until the tariffs start kicking in and avocados cost $18 a piece and that sort of thing. But, you know, he's going to be he's a businessman. He doesn't think about other things. He has no empathy for people. He has no human empathy. And I'm not so sure he has any sympathy either. When he looks at things, he just looks at them in terms of transactional costs and transactional savings and profits. And so, you know, where he's going, I don't know, but he is a different person in this calculus right now. And I don't know how to figure what's going to happen to the Palestinians. But I do know that so far, all he's proposed has been purely transactional and fairly stupid in terms of the Palestinians. There's a solution. There's always been a solution. And the solution is a state for them, a state that isn't attacked periodically by the Israelis, and a state from which they don't attack the Israelis from. And people say, that's hard. That's so impossible. Oh, you can't have a two-state solution. It's impossible to have a two-state solution. That's hogwash. It is not impossible. It's just that the United States of America, the American empire, does not want one. It does not want peace. It wants Israel to keep everything in turmoil on its behalf in that region.
I'm so glad you said that, because everyone keeps saying, well, Israel doesn't want it. But no, the United States government doesn't want it either, because having a two-state solution, that would mean that the Palestinian people would have to have a military. And the U.S. does not want them to have a military, nor does Benjamin Netanyahu. But they keep all this blame, they keep pushing on Israel. It is very much the same interest that the U.S. government has as well. It's not just the Likud party in Israel. And I think more Americans really need to, I think some people are waking up to that, but I think more Americans are going to see, especially during this Trump term, that both of these political parties agree and support what Israel is doing. And that's a big one. And that brings me, go ahead.
In 2004, about the time Powell was getting ready to do his last bit for the roadmap for the peace process, for the Middle East peace process, you know, all those terms we use, all those buzzwords. George W. Bush entertained the then Prime Minister of Israel, Ariel Sharon, in the Oval Office. Bush turned to Sharon and said, everything's failed. The peace process, the Middle East peace process is dead. The roadmap, what's the roadmap to? It's a roadmap to hell. Everything's failed. For 50 plus years, it's all failed. Over to you, Mr. Prime Minister. Sharon looked like a deer caught in the headlight. What do you mean by that, Mr. President? I mean, over to you. From now on, we'll back in anything you want to do. That was the policy being undisguised. That was the policy just being thrown at the Israeli Prime Minister of the time. Go do what you have to do. We've been doing that ever since.
Well said there. And that leads me to Russia and Ukraine. It was just reported that Zelensky is now stating that they have lost $70 billion that has come from the United States. Now, we've been giving them aid ever since, as long as I know, ever since the start of the Ukraine war. We've been giving them billions and billions of dollars. And I think more Americans have started to push back on that as well, because they're saying, like, all this money and all these resources are going out to the door to Ukraine. And part of that package included healthcare, which Glenn Greenwald had discovered. And Americans are starting to look around and say, wait a minute, we don't have bridges that are functioning properly. We don't have healthcare for everyone in this country, but we're giving billions to Ukraine. This particular situation, and I've spoken to Scott Ritter about this as well, I don't think there is a win for Ukraine in the end. Even if they have a negotiation, I don't see Ukraine getting what they want, or I don't see any benefit for the Ukrainian people. What I see is a country that is failing economically and has lost a lot of people because they're just pulling people off the street to go fight this war that they know they can't win.
You're right. Russia's won. There's no question of that. No question at all. The only question being asked about that on the other side is, when is Zelensky going to either be assassinated or removed? Because I'm not negotiating with that dude. He is not a legitimate representative of the state of Ukraine. And he isn't. He isn't. So they need to have elections. They need to elect someone new. I suspect that what's going to happen is the oligarchs in Ukraine themselves will probably take Zelensky out. That's what happened in the past. Many times did it happen in the past. When I was first chief of staff of the State Department, I had to babysit the then Ukrainian ex-president who had been nuked. I don't know if you remember that, but he had actually been poisoned. They said it was the Russians who did it. So he came to this country for some treatment. And I had to deal with Yulia Tymoshenko, too, who was a crook par excellence. She had cornered the telecommunications market in Ukraine, and she was a multi-millionaire. That's all I dealt with was crooks. So to your money question, where that money has gone is to the oligarchs in Ukraine who are still getting it. And as long as they're still getting it, they're going to support Zelensky. And much of it is coming back here to Lockheed Martin, to Grumman, and to other military contractors who are making the weapons that we're sending to Ukraine. So some of the money does come back here, but not for the purposes you said, the purposes it's needed for, like medical care and such. It came back to feed the military industrial complex. The war is finished. It's over. And I thought Trump meant it when he said, going to cut off the money, going to cut off the arms, and then we're going to sit down and talk, and by Easter, we're going to have an agreement. By Easter, that's what he said. We're going to have an agreement. Keith Kellogg even said that, his special envoy, who's as old as I am, 80 years old. I wouldn't have him. I'd have somebody else in there as my envoy. But I don't know if he knows anybody else he thinks he can trust. But they need to sit down and they need to have a conversation, Putin and Trump, or they're very well established and accepted on both sides envoys. And we need to get this thing stopped because we're still killing people. We're killing lots of Ukrainians. And the only reason we're killing them is because Zelensky won't give up. And Trump has said what the parameters are. You have to say no NATO membership for Ukraine, ever. Read my lips, ever. neutrality for Ukraine, maybe EU membership somewhere out in the future. Oh, and by the way, Russia has sovereignty over those portions it now occupies. Ukraine, you'll never get them back. You'll never get Crimea back. You are going to be not a rump state because you still got a lot of territory left. Plus, you've got the port of Odessa, which, as a military professional, had I been Russia, I would have taken that port, because then that would give them all the ports on the northern rim of the Black Sea. And if they ever do have to fight a war with NATO, that would give them a significant advantage. So, but they didn't do that, which tells me all these people are lying. Lindsey Graham and all the rest of them about, oh, they're going to take Estonia. They're going to take Lithuania. They're going to take all of NATO. They'll go into Poland. He doesn't want that. What he wants is the United States and its weapon systems off his border, the way they would have been in Ukraine. And that's what he's got now. So let's give it to him and let's get this thing shut down. But go back to the empire. There are people around Trump. Elon Musk is one of them. Peter Thiel is another of them, who understand what you and I have been talking about. They understand that they're losing. They're losing this great suction of power away to China. And so they're doing everything they can to stall that, to prevent it from happening fully. And this is part of their way of doing it, bleeding Russia through Ukraine, and even bleeding Russia through Syria, if you think about it for a moment. And guess what else we're doing right now? Colin, forget his, Georgescu. Colin Georgescu just won the preliminary elections in Romania. But he's threatened to take Romania out of NATO. He's threatened to be another Viktor Orban type leader. Well, what did we do? We sent the CIA in to foment against him and try to destroy the elections that he might win and become the leader of Romania. We're doing the same thing in Moldova. What are we doing in Georgia? The Georgia Dream Party won just by the skin of its teeth. And the Georgia Dream Party in power right now wants a balanced policy. They don't want to make Moscow angry nor Washington. They want a balanced policy. What are we doing? We got the CIA in there trying to overthrow that government and establish a government that wants to be on NATO's side. Bring Georgia into NATO even. What happened last time they tried that? My president went to Tbilisi and said, besides Saakashvili, then the president of Georgia, that Georgia would be a member of NATO very soon in the future. What did Russia do? It invaded the two northwestern provinces, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, and took them over. So, I mean, there's your prelude to Ukraine. Look what Georgia threatened to do. Look what Russia did to Georgia as a consequence. Now you're doing this in Ukraine, and you think Georgia won't do, or Russia won't do something about it? It surely did. So this is a game this is the great game we used to call it, when Russia and Britain and British Empire were playing it. Well, we're playing it now. We're playing it for high stakes. We're playing it for the remaining whatever time the American empire has left. The kicker here, the real crime, sin, malfeasance in office, whatever you want to call it, is that Xi Jinping and China have no desire to fight us whatsoever. None whatsoever. They are convinced, and probably rightfully so, that economically, trade-wise, commerce-wise, they're going to beat us in the long run anyway. They may not, but they don't want a war. They would rather see, and Xi Jinping actually uses this phrase in Chinese, it's sort of ASEAN community. It's like ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, where there's no security component to it. There's no hegemonic attempt to it. It's all trade. It's all people trading. It's all people doing business with one another. They call it cooperation, comedy, and collaboration. They don't want a war. We're the ones who want the war. And that scares me because I know the state of our military right now. And if we went to war with China in the South China Sea or anywhere else for that matter, we would lose conventionally. And I'm really worried what we'd do then. I think we'd probably go nuclear. And that's a very worrisome thought.
I think so as well. I also feel like our actions are pushing more countries into BRICS, to be
Yes.
honest with you, because
I'm just looking at it the other day. It's Saudi Arabia's they're mulling their offer over. You got two other countries that have been invited, and I think we're up to 23 now.
Yes. Yeah. Forming a multipolar world. And I think a lot of times, I think a lot of people point fingers at China because easy to do so, right? That like, oh, there is a Chinese spy balloon over there, etc. Like, and I've tried to explain to people, oftentimes we are the ones that are the aggressor, and oftentimes these countries will be fine if we just left them alone. But the U.S. doesn't want to do that. Overthrowing leaders in other countries. Look at the disaster that's happened in Syria now. Like, it's complete chaos from what I've seen. And I think that, what message would you send to people who are, because I've told people don't join the military, right? So, and I come from a military family. My dad sits back and he sees these things that are happening.
I say the same thing.
Yeah. He sits back and sees the things that are happening right now. And he said, this is ridiculous. Like, it was a lot different back then, like during his time as well. But I do feel like I try to tell people don't join the military because, and I get it. You may sign up because you think you're going to get, you want the benefits, or you want to maybe get out of poverty, or, you want guaranteed housing, those types of things. I understand that. But you're also signing yourself up to participate in these wars, to go abroad and to kill people and maybe not come back home. And then you have to deal with that and reckon with that, I think, for the rest of your life. And what would be your message to people who don't fully understand the U.S. involvement in foreign policy and do believe that Russia is the aggressor or China is the aggressor?
My argument to them is that sit down for a few minutes and I'll explain to you from my 45 years of experience in the military, diplomacy, and other places in the government, how the empire is doing all this and how your country, which you have not been very cognizant of for a long time, which, as Ben Franklin said, it's a republic and a democracy only if you can keep it, you haven't kept, is going awry. And you need to do something about it. In fact, you need to do something quite a while ago. And then they usually say to me, if I'm talking to an audience, or what do you suggest we do? And I have all kinds of suggestions for them. Vote the people you have put in Congress out, because I can count on 3 fingers maybe who there is worthy of the name of representing the American people. There are just a bunch of money-hungry bums. They sit around, do insider trading. Their whole goal in the Senate is to leave a millionaire, or a millionaire 3 or 4 times over. And many of them are millionaires when they go in. Take Rick Scott from Florida, for example. Rick Scott put together this huge healthcare company that milked Medicare every state in the union virtually, made Florida its hometown, and then ran for the Senate. That's what we have today. We have those kinds of people representing us in the Congress, because the American people don't really care anymore. If they ever did, they certainly don't care today. We got people in there like Mitch McConnell. We got people in there like Chuck Schumer. We got people in there like Lindsey Graham. These are despicable people who do not give a damn about the American electorate. Only when they have to get reelected. And then they just dole out the money that many of them get from the military-industrial complex. It's almost like buying votes. And Americans don't vote anymore. We did a study at William & Mary to see just what the average turnout was in a non-federal election in a state in America. And we found out that in many districts, in many places where representatives, governors, and other people were being elected, less than 10% of the electorate that was qualified to vote actually voted. Ted Cruz won his first term with 11%. You can buy that much. You can buy that much because we don't care anymore. Do you know that 90 million Americans didn't vote in this last election for president? Now, that's the one place where people usually do come out, at least over the 50% mark. But that leaves in country that has 340 million people, that leaves a lot of people who didn't vote at all. About 90 million didn't vote at all. Part of that, I think, was your commentary on Kamala Harris there at the beginning. She didn't get many people inspired to vote. And part of it was they didn't want to contrarily vote for Donald Trump. But they didn't vote. They didn't vote at all. So we are not taking care of our republic, and our republic has become an empire, and the people who are running it don't give a damn about the American people. You can bet your bottom dollar on that. Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, Robert Mercer, Miriam Adelson, they don't give a damn about the American people. They could care less about the American people. All they care about is their fortune and their power. That's it, period. In some respects, Donald Trump is a sort of a model of this type of person. And it remains to be seen how much damage this model is going to do.
I also feel like the ones who did try to fight in some way, shape, or form were pushed out by big money, like Cori Bush, Jamal Bowman, Dennis Kucinich. Also, I feel like those voices, they made sure that they would not regain their seats, and that tells you everything. There's no real push from inside Congress to remove corporate money from electoral politics.
They wanted to stay there. They wanted to stay there. They don't want that money gone because that's their purse. That's their kitty. That black money coming in, that money coming in with no need for the donor to disclose anything about where it came from. That's their wherewithal, that in the military-industrial complex. I was talking to an Al Jazeera guy this morning in an interview about Tommy Tuberville from Alabama. And he said, how much money does he take? I said, well, when he was adjudicating an argument or a committee meeting with an argument about Lockheed Martin getting a certain contract, at that moment he was trading stock in Lockheed Martin worth $50,000. I mean, this is our Congress.
It's insane, but I'm glad that you brought up Congress, though, because I do feel like a lot of times most people come out to vote during the presidential election, but during some of these congressional races that are during like the midterms, not during a presidential election year, a lot of people don't show up to vote. And a lot of people are not paying attention to who's running in these congressional races. And so there's a large majority, to your point, that does not vote at all. But then the ones who are voting, I think a lot of times people are just voting for their party and they're not really paying attention to the issues or where these politicians stand, or they're not paying attention to the way that they voted on legislation, which brings up another point. One thing that I think Matt Gaetz was really good about, and now he's gone, but I don't agree with him on most things, but I did agree with him on the subject of single issue bills in Congress. Because there's a number of times where politicians said, well, I didn't like this issue in the bill, but I voted for the bill because it included this. So like the Ukraine funding bill is oftentimes packaged along with other issues. And it's like, if you vote against that, then it's like, oh, those other issues are not going to pass. But I feel like that's intentional. I feel like if Congress wanted to have single issue bills, they could. I feel like they combine all those subjects together because they still want the military industrial complex and the corporations to get their bidding. So they mix all these things together. But I thought that was a strong point that he did have about let's just have single issue bills. They're not even reading these bills. So it was revealed by like AOC. She said people didn't even have time to read over the TikTok bill. They're not even reading them. They don't have time to read 4,000 pages. And people are just voting for things because they're told to.
And you know who writes the bills now? The lobbyists write the bills. So if there's a bill affecting Lockheed Martin or there's a bill affecting Bechtel Engineering or whatever, the lobbyist who is working now, there's a Congress worth of lobbyists on K Street now. And many of them are former congressmen who know the buildings really well. They know how to work the system. They come back in and they lobby for these bills. And the bills are written by the people who actually come from the company affected by the legislation. So it's like Dick Cheney when he was packing the bureaucracy. He packed fisheries with people who were against fish. He packed forestry with people who were against forest. He packed the bureaucracy, the regulatory commissions, the groups that were supposed to look after the environment and so forth, with businessmen whose whole goal in life, or women whose whole goal in life was to destroy that agency. I mean, and Donald Trump, I understand, is doing that big time too. I mean, he learned from Cheney in many respects. Elon Musk and some of the other people who are supposedly making the government more efficient. Yeah, watch how they make it more efficient for them.
That's right. And one more question for you. Speaking of Dick Cheney again, Kamala Harris did brag about getting the support from Dick Cheney.
I thought that was hilarious.
I was just curious why you feel Dick Cheney did support Kamala Harris.
I think they had no other choice. In his case, he had no other choice because his daughter had done it, and he's pretty loyal to his offspring. And so I think he was following in suit to give some reinforcement to what she'd done. But I remember when she did it, my wife was still alive at that time, and when she first came out, and I essentially said, we're going to regret this. She's going to regret this, and the Republican Party's going to regret taking her on, and they're going to destroy each other basically because she's going to find no home now anywhere. And the Democrats are going to be out of power. I predicted that. And she's going to be a pariah, and he's a pariah. And, going around the world and getting lectured by Chinese, do you see that? Where he's being lectured by the Chinese statesman saying, we do not seek hegemony like you do, and we don't make that a part of our portfolio like you do. And he's sitting there in the chair, looking at him like, he's so old now, like me, he can hardly move. But I think that's in the past. That's done and gone, and they're done and gone. I don't think Liz Cheney has anything left to give to the country that's positive. And I don't think Dick Cheney does either. I really think we need to clean house. I'd be willing to raise my hand and say, if you'll leave, I'll leave. But you would have to be the entire Congress and much of the surrounding apparatus. We need to get a whole new government. And I don't mean Donald Trump and Elon Musk and Peter Thiel and all these people. We need a whole new government. We need a government that is responsive at least partially to the real needs of the American people. Not a government, for example, that'll look at polls that show 95% of Americans want some sort of gun control and then refuse to vote any kind of gun control. It's just crazy. We're not responding to the desires of the American people. And I'm not saying that we should respond to those who want us to vote them the treasury. The ancient Greeks had a theory about democracy that it goes through stages, and one of the penultimate stages is when the people vote themselves the state treasury. Well, to a certain extent, I don't know if you saw Tom Massey. I think it was yesterday, the kind of recalcitrant, iconoclastic congressman from Kentucky. He's a Republican, but I've been with Tom in the office when he said essentially, this is the most broke dick government in the history of the world. He'd say you can't get anything done here. He was a big fan of the one issue bills too. But yesterday he did a little demonstration, or it was on YouTube yesterday. Had to be fairly recent. He got a glass of tea, and it was about half full. And he asked someone to pass him their glass of tea. And they did, and he filled the glass of tea that was half full all the way to the brim. And he said, now, what did I just do? Give me a simple scientific word for what I just did. Well, there are several you could use, but he wanted you to use dilution. I just diluted the tea in the glass that was half full that I poured this glass, it was water actually, water into. I diluted the tea. And what do you think we do when we print $5 trillion more and dump it into the economy? What do you think we do? We just diluted the economy. And he goes on to what that means in terms of inflation, eggs going to this price, milk going to this price, and so forth. And he says, now, The argument here in this body is that because Europe and other countries are doing the same thing, in other words, living way beyond their means, it doesn't matter. Hogwash, he said. And that's where we are. Fiscally, that's where we are. The Office of Management and Budget says that this empire, by 2037, is going to be $50.2 trillion in aggregate debt. Think about that. We're already paying this year $1 trillion in interest payments. You got to pay that or you default. So we're paying the defense budget in interest payments on that debt. On 50.2 trillion aggregate debt, the interest payments will be over $2 trillion. In other words, we'll be paying the equivalent of Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, and the defense budget every year for interest. We can't sustain that. We can't sustain that, even though we got this new philosophy that we just keep printing money because we're the empire. We're the empire. It's another reason we don't want to go away as the empire, because then we have to pay the piper. We are broke.
I hear you there. Although I will say modern monetary theory would say that the deficit ceiling is a myth, that there's no deficit ceiling and all that jazz, and that the government can.
Your baker and your banker and your lawyer and your candlestick maker.
Yeah.
Oh, no, nations are different. Nations are different. Well, they are different as long as you are the hegemon who can dictate the terms of trade. But that is going away.
Interesting. Colonel Wilkerson, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Hey guys, this was a savvy clip. If you like what you saw, hit that like button and subscribe.